Hello and welcome back. I'm Shayna Cersei with Umbrella Arts Academy, and today we are going to be painting these lovely Snapdragons. These are one of my favorite flowers to paint. They're loose and easy to do, and you can paint them in such a variety of colors. So let's go over the colors that we're going to use for these three today. So first we're going to use a cadmium yellow. You could also use a Hansa yellow light. That would work perfectly for this particular project. I'm going to also use a magenta. This is a Quniacradone Magenta from Core. So these are all Core paints, and then a combination of magenta and my yellow. I'm going to mix to make an orange color. So really I'm just taking the two colors from the tubes and then mixing to make a third orange color. And then lastly, I'll also be using the Sap Green here for the stems and the leaves. I'll be using two brushes for this today just to show you the difference that two different size brushes can make, but you could do it with either size. So I'll be using a size 12 brush, and that is my silver black velvet brush that I'm using right now. And I'll also be using a size 6, and I happen to be using the Princeton Aqua Elite brush. You can take a look at my supply list in the description for the supplies that I use, including my brushes, paints, and papers. I'm painting on, this is actually 100% Cotton Academy paper. This is, I don't have this all the time, it's in a block, but I really like this paper, and I'm excited to use it more often. It's a little bit cheaper than Arches watercolor paper, but has some of the same results. I find it's very close in terms of texture to paint on this paper. So I really like it, and I will definitely be ordering more of it. I will absolutely still use Arches for a lot of what I do, but it's nice to have a variety of papers to kind of reach out to. So take a look at that supply list. I'm just resetting up my colors to have a nice clean palette here. I'm remixing my orange from my magenta and yellow, and then we will get started. I do want to show you the shape of the flower. So a Snapdragon is made up, it's a tall stalk flower, but it's made up of a lot of little flowers all gathered around this stalk. So the way I paint those in this loose concept is that, or this loose style, I should say, is that I imagine a bud that they all come together at the base there, but then they just flare out, and I paint this type of bud or this flower. I can paint it to the right, to the left, I can paint it up, and I can paint it facing down. So you can see the brush strokes end at the end there, and they're open, but they all kind of come together at the base there. And then these are attached to the stalk by these big green buds that kind of hold them all together. So I'm going to take some Sap Green while my petals and flowers are still wet and just touch it to the base of those, adhering it to the stalk. And that's really how they look. And then there'll be a lot of different areas on the stalk where there will be green buds, but the flowers haven't popped out yet, particularly towards the top of the stalk. And you'll see that here. So I'm going to find my way kind of a little further down the stalk to start my flowers, or those really open blooms that are on the stalk. And we can take a little bit closer look too as we kind of work our way down this stalk. But I'm just going to loosely, trying not to overthink it, work my way down, having some overlapping, having some going out to the right, the left, going up and down over the center of the stalk, but not trying to control it too much. Leaving some small gaps, that's important, between some of the buds, but also making some clusters that are on top of each other. That gives it a more natural look. And then I'm going to take my Sap Green and I'm going to find those little gaps. Whoops, we went a little bit out of focus here. We'll get it back in. There we go. And I'm going to find those gaps in between for the stalks, but I want to do it while the buds are, or the petals and the blooms are still wet, because I want that green to bleed in to look like the petals and the blooms are coming out of these green buds, because that's what it does look like on a Snapdragon. They're emerging from these hardy, stalky green buds all up that stalk. And then at the very top, it's mostly green. They haven't quite opened or bloomed yet. There'll be a few little pops of color outside of these tiny little buds at the top. And after I'm done putting in all of the green, I'm gonna go back and take a look to see if there's any other areas where I could put in a few more blooms to fill in some spaces or gaps. You don't have to do this. You can do it all on the first round and just leave it, but I'm gonna go in and add just a little bit more of that yellow color to fill in some of those gaps and areas. And then I do also like to go back to that top green area and add just a little bit of color up there for a little pop. And that's those blooms that haven't really emerged yet, but will. So for our second stalk here, we are going to be using magenta as well as that orange that we mixed with our cadmium yellow and quinacridone magenta together. So I'll just be starting with magenta and then dropping in bits of that orange color as I go along. This just creates a multi-dimensional, multi-hued flower, which can be really, really pretty. And then I'll approach the green stalk the same way, finding the gaps in between, making sure that some of that green bleeds into the colors of the blooms to show that they are attached, and then also going right to the top there with that green, adding in the taller green stalk at the top and dropping in just a few dabs of color to show emerging blooms right at the top. You can see here I'm even going back and dropping in a few darker hues or a little bit more saturated paint in some of those areas to create a little more contrast and a little more depth. Again, these are loose flowers, they're not hyper realistic, but I still want to create something that isn't flat, that has some dimension to it. So dropping in little bits of color here and there or deeper, darker shades in some areas helps achieve that effect. So for our third stalk, I'm actually going to switch to a size 6 round brush just to show you the different levels of control and size of blooms that you can achieve with using different size brushes. The colors we're going to use are just a combination of that magenta and cadmium yellow to create this lovely peachy orange color. And then I'll be dropping in little bits of some pure yellow as well along the way. And again, approaching that stem in the exact same way. So you can make a beautiful field or bouquet of these Snapdragon flowers that will just be so lovely and so vibrant together. You can keep them all in one color family, or you can really make a burst of, beautiful colors all over the spectrum. I'm going to drop in a little hints of magenta throughout as well, just to create, again, a multi-toned flower, but it's going to be much more orange than magenta like in the last bloom that we did. And here we go with our green, our sap green stem, finding those gaps in between. But you can see my blooms, although it's still filling up the same amount of space, the individual strokes are a little bit more controlled and a little bit smaller, so the blooms look just a slightly more detailed, not as loose as the ones with the larger brush. I love both styles and I think they both look really great. But just to give you an idea of the difference between using different brush sizes. All right, we're gonna take a moment to add in some leaves towards the bottom of our stalks. And these are just kind of long, kind of squiggly leaves at the top. So I just use my brush, and I'll do this a couple more times. I press down and pull up and just kind of squiggle my way through the top there. And just filling in some areas. I'm not overthinking this again or trying to get too complicated or put too many leaves in, just something to create a nice grounded base to those stalks. And then as I look over my blooms, I just noticed that I want to add a few more drops of a deeper color or shade of that sap green, not creating any new color, but just adding another layer to give a little bit more depth and dimension. And you can see, especially in this yellow stalk, you can see how just adding a little bit more of that color right on top gives it a much darker, richer hue and creates some really interesting depth around that stalk. And I'll do the same thing on the others as well. And this is just finishing up and adding in details, but we are coming to the end of our Snapdragon painting. I really love these, and I'm so glad you could join me for this tutorial. I'm Shayna Searcy with Umbrella Arts Academy. As always, feel free to look at the description to see some links of other places you can find me, my supply list, as well as options to join my studio crew, where you can get even more in-depth, longer tutorials and exclusive content that's only in the studio crew. But I'll see you back here for our next floral February painting shortly.